Roland, I want to speak with you a little bit about religion and art. I always like to talk about that topic with you. You have such a fine feel for the world of art. I know you appreciate music and go to the concerts and love to go to museums and opera and to see plays and Broadway and so on. So I always find it enlightening to be able to speak with you about that. I think the whole question of religion and art is often a difficult one. I think one of the questions arises, how does religion and art how do they relate to one another? In one sense, art early on and up to the time of the Renaissance through the medieval period, I suppose art supported religion, it seems to me. It was sort of on the side of religion, and everything about it, to go into a cathedral, to listen to the Gregorian chant, to see the rising forms of the Gothic cathedral, and the artwork therein gave one a settled, complete world. There was a sense of harmony. You knew where you fit, and the art supported what the religious message was all about.
And the church was the patron who actually got the artwork commissioned and music or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there seemed to be another period where art began to challenge religious notions in a way. And so maybe during the Renaissance that began to happen, that whatever was painted, you weren't so sure it was furthering the work of religion or not. It looked different, and it went back to Greek models very often, to the previous pagan world, and people worried about that.
It got more secularistic. A word that they often use for the medieval period is God-centered, theocentric, and then it became anthropocentric and man-centered. And you get away from explicit religion, and often it's this so-called secular approach.
Right, and then there's also a way in which in that interaction, I think that art has sort of taken the place of religion. It's the aesthetic experience that is really the way to God. I think we see a reminder of that in the world today, that people would say, well, they would rather walk in nature on Sunday, that's more prayerful to them than to go to Mass, for example. Sure. That it's that kind of encounter with the world of nature that would bring out the presence of God in the world. So there would be an example where art, or the aesthetic experience, would sort of elbow religion to the side and say religion is false or hypocritical or phony or second-rate, and the real pure experience of what God is all about comes in the encounter with beauty through art.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm setting that up as maybe a typology, or as the interaction between religion and art historically. And so there are difficulties as soon as you begin to bring up the topic here.
Oh, yeah.
But I would like to move this in the direction of a type of art that doesn't seem to be either explicitly or implicitly religious. That's a type of art that shows what I'll call the discontinuity in the world. It's art that maybe for some people almost approaches the ugly. The prime example I have is Picasso's Guernica, which I saw when it was on display in New York, a gigantic painting, and Picasso painted it after there was a terrible air attack on the Basque people, and he was protesting war. That's what it really does. Well, in many sense, it's ugly. I mean, things are torn apart. You don't get a sense of harmony. You get a sense of discontinuity, of contradiction, that things are out of order. And yet, one might say that there's a religious dimension to that artwork. Sure. It's telling us something about the distance that we really are from God's world the way He intended it.
Oh, I think so. That was at the Museum of Modern Art for many years in New York City, and I saw it a number of times. They had a very large section, a Picasso section. It's back at the Prado, I believe, now in Madrid. That it was in his will that he wanted it back in Spain when democracy was restored. There are even cartoon-like figures, and if somebody described it, you would say, I don't think that's going to be very powerful. And yet as you stand, and I believe all black and white, too. They didn't use color. And yet as you stand before it, the tremendous expanse of that canvas tells you something about war and about its horror. You know, the central figure, I remember, I think there's a woman screaming over her child who has died, and there's a bull-like figure representing military power and all that kind of thing. And it puts it into more symbolic elements, but what it does, I believe, is that it distances you enough so you can think about it and feel about it, whereas if you actually looked at war, something tells me we would be so numb that we couldn't make any sense out of it at all, but the artist helps us.
You know, I was thinking, Roland, in relation to films in that regard, when it's so long it has taken us to even look at Vietnam, what a horrible experience in our history, and so many young men hurt, and terrible psychological damage as well as the physical damage, and what it did to the national morale. And there was a long period of time when one simply couldn't think about that. One didn't want to talk about it, or at least not drink it in very deeply. And then what seemed to happen is there were a number of artists who were willing to start to make films about it. And through the world of film, an art form, we were able to begin to come to terms with that. I heard many people say when they saw some of the movies about Vietnam that that's the first time they had any sense of what it was about. I remember a Navy chaplain telling me that after years of attending to some of the veterans, they would not trust him to for them to tell him exactly what it was like. They would only talk to other veterans about it. So the terrible hidden quality of all of that, and it seemed as though some of these movies were able to bring that out.
Oh, I think so.
What was it? Apocalypse Now was one.
Yes, that was one, and Stone has made several of them. Born on the 4th of July, got Ron Kovic's, and Platoon. And
yes, Platoon.
Yeah, there have been a number of really powerful films. I think not only the people who were in Vietnam and who had witnessed the killing and the bloodshed, but actually the entire nation was at war. You know, the 60s and the early 70s were such traumatic and angry and emotional times that I think that not only the veterans, them most of all, of course, but also the entire nation had to go through a period of psychological healing. And there really were scars for a time where you couldn't even think about the agony that had happened. It certainly couldn't make any sense of it. And it was, let's see, the early 70s. It was a good 15, 20 years before all that happened.
As you're talking there, Roland, two things came to my mind about what the work of art would do, like Picasso's Guernica and those films. We haven't come up with other examples, but we might do that as we go along. But what they do is, one, help us face whatever it was that happened. And then you were using another term, that is, find some meaning in it. It's almost as though clearly the meaning is a triumph over the chaos of the discontinuity, of the contradictions. And again, that fits in theologically with what we think needs to happen in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that there is suffering as represented by the figure of Job, for example, in the Hebrew Scriptures. And then there is that in the Christian understanding, a redemption. That is, the cross of Christ leads to resurrection. But you can't have a simple, easy resurrection. You can't just have Easter without Good Friday. The Christian paradox has always been essential, that the cross must be there. What was it Paul said? I preach Jesus Christ crucified. That's it. I'm not going to fool around with this philosophy that he tried at Athens. You know, when he went to Corinth, he's going to get down to the message. I preach Christ crucified. And there is that notion, therefore, that there's no easy or cheap grace, that the suffering has to be part of it. And I think what we're saying is there's a type of artwork that lets us face these discontinuities, contradictions, sufferings, evil in the world, and if it functions effectively in a religious sense, there is at least some glimmer of redemption, some glimmer of hope that comes out of that.
Well, even from a psychological point of view, you have to be able to find meaning. I think of Viktor Frankl in his book, The Search for Meaning, and writing about the concentration camps and the horror that the people experienced there. But the ones who survived and who lived through it were the ones who in some sense could get some meaning, you know, that there's some purpose, that I have to go on living because God wants me to do something, or I have something, or whatever.
Or I have a loved one in Frankel's part, right?
Exactly,
it was his wife that, and images of his wife that were so crucial to him.
Something can help you to hold on, and have some sense of meaning. Because of its absolute chaos, and you're suffering terribly, then the only solution really is to end it, you know, suicide, or just I think people also die when they give up psychologically. And
well, they know that from the experience in extreme cases, the concentration camps. If they thought they were going to be liberated on a certain day and it came and passed, many people would die. I mean, there's a lot of examples of that kind of thing, horrible even to talk about, but psychologically true. And Viktor Frankl, as you said, is a good example of transforming a horrible experience into what he called logotherapy. That is a therapeutic approach that would really help you to find meaning even in a life that isn't all that great. Now, that has meaning for ordinary people, too.
Sure.
I mean, not in extreme cases, but people suffering from sickness and breakdowns of relationships, divorces, the death of loved ones, and so on. Somehow one has to put a map of meaning on this chaotic situation.
What does Hamlet say in his speech in Shakespeare's play about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? And we all have them. You know, there are traumatic things and hurting things. And if you can't integrate them somehow into a view of the world and get your life together with some cohesion, then you're going to be an extremely unhappy person. And it seems to me that religion ought to help people to do that, or religion is useless. And for example, if you do have a deep faith that even though I am suffering terribly now, let's say after a divorce, or after the death of a loved one, or in a war situation, but if, for example, you have the faith that nonetheless there is a God in charge of the universe who is finally a God of love, and that somehow cohesion will come out of that, it enables you to go on and to have some sense of meaning.
Yes, that's well put, and it's a great statement of faith, and what in our Christian faith centered on Jesus Christ, who goes to his death in terrible suffering, but also in great trust of the one he called Abba.
I think of some of the people I've known fighting for social justice, and I mean really great ones. You know, I'm fought for it too, but I don't think I've been all that great. But I mean, like the ones who have dedicated their whole life to it. And it just seems to me that at times they must get terribly frustrated that they fight war and yet we go to war again in the Gulf or wherever. They fight poverty and yet it increases. There are more people homeless and on and on. And they have to have, it seems to me, a very deep faith. There has to be something inside them that helps them to keep on going and not give up.
No, that what we're claiming here is that the world of art can help us to deal with exactly this reality. And I suppose what we've seen in the 19th and 20th century is a growing recognition of the contradictions built into human existence. In other words, when the First World War was a shattering experience for the Christian world. Karl Barth's theology grew out of that. I mean, a nice, neat theology that he had learned, and simple truths and that he had preached for a while from what he called liberal Protestantism simply didn't wash anymore. And Karl Barth was forced to work out a new theology. I think so that what we've got in the 19th and 20th century is all kind of authors more in tune with the tragic dimension. We have the existentialist philosophers who talk about the human condition, but when they say human condition, it has a negative tinge to it. They've got a sense that we can't have what we want, that the human situation is flawed, something that we've always called original sin. So that I think what we get in art in the 20th century, along with those theological, philosophical themes that I was talking about, is a graphic portrayal of that. We might look at something like Beckett's Waiting for Godot. Now, not everyone's seen that, but that whole line of thought, Beckett, his plays, John Paul Sartre's plays like No Exit, the novels of Camus, people know that literature to some degree, and it has a heavy character to it, doesn't it? It's terribly difficult. It's bringing out the estrangement. One of their favorite words is alienation. One of the favorite themes they paint or write about is alienation, estrangement. We're cut off from what we ought to be. And I suppose the art form that has gone along with that we've commonly called expressionism. Well, you want to comment on some of that, Roland?
Yeah, I would say that what a great play like Waiting for Godot does, or a great opera for that matter, or a great novel or a painting, when it treats something that is so painful and so on, and somehow it makes us feel better. I remember, as a specific example, some years ago at the Chicago Lyric Opera, I saw a production of Richard Strauss's opera Electra, and it's based on the ancient Greek play of the woman who was whose father was murdered, and she spends all her life trying to murder her mother. And finally, when her brother returns, the two of them together accomplish that. I mean, this is not what you call comedy. It is a very demanding play and a very demanding opera. And it was one of the greatest productions I've ever seen at the Chicago Lyric. I mean, it was just, for me, it was overwhelming. And I remember leaving that theater, and I felt good. I mean, I felt like I was walking on air. And people say, well, this was about a woman murdering her mother. You know, how in the world could that have had that effect? And I guess the answer would be catharsis, that in some ways that deals with very deep issues that all of us touch in some way or another. And the dramatic presentation gives cohesion to it, some sense of unity. I'm not sure I can explain it completely, but I do know that great art helps you to go on living and get some sense of purpose and meaning and all that.
You mentioned the word catharsis, which takes us back to the ancient Greeks and some of Aristotle's ideas of what the plays ought to be about, what art ought to do, and it had to do with a cleansing, didn't it? There was a purging that he saw. It's a pre-Freudian idea that there's a way in which our emotions are cleansed by going through them vicariously in the play. And of course, I suppose Freud, after Freud, we would have other explanations maybe of some of that, of acting out fantasies or dealing with the contradictions found in the psyche, finding a way to deal with the id, and not letting the superego totally control the instinctual side of us. In other words, there'd be all kind of psychological explanations, but I think the fact of the matter is that what you just said probably happens to many people in encountering works of art. I wonder if it happens in terms of television-type programs that have a bite to them or have a stronger message. I'm not just thinking of some of the pap that would be on, but stronger type programs that allow one to identify with maybe some of the negative emotions that are going on there.
Oh, I think so. I only watch maybe about a half a dozen programs regularly. L.A. Law would be one of them. And some of the comedies, I think Golden Girls and Murphy Brown on Monday nights, they're basically lighter comedy shows, but they also touch deeper issues in a comic mode. And a couple of new programs, WIOU, I found to be very enjoyable so far. And I think it's called Law and Order on Tuesday nights. Now, they take very real issues, often lifting them right out of the headlines, and then treat them fictionally. And admittedly, in the space of a half hour or an hour, you're not going to solve all the world's problems. But if you at least ask a question where it gets formulated well, and it enables the viewer to start thinking about that a little more deeply, and good writers are able to do that. I don't think there's a lot of it on television, but there is some of it, and it's very thought-provoking. It's good.
Yeah, and therefore you're getting some sense of the tragic side of life, the problem areas, and so on, which this form of art that we're talking about ends up dealing with. Just to respond to your personal thing, I remember being at a play in Texas one time that had, I unfortunately can't think of the title, maybe it'll come to me, but it was about a doctor who was gradually co-opted by the Nazis, just step by step, just some little thing, anti-Semitic note they caught in one of his writings, and he really didn't feel that strongly, and it kept building up, playing on, bringing him in, getting. But before long, he's a commandant at Auschwitz or one of the death camps, and I mean, it's just horribly powerful. I remember sitting there at the end, and everyone's I couldn't even clap.
Yes.
I think the people who took me thought I was unappreciative of the play or something, but I was so taken by it. So I couldn't clap. I didn't want to talk. I didn't want to see anybody afterwards. I just wanted to sort of be enclosed, I suppose, in my own thoughts. Now there, I don't know if we'd call it catharsis, but it certainly was a strong emotional thing that it did to me. And, you know, and I suppose if you'd say, well, what's the message? Well, I'd only get the message stepping back after many weeks or months or whatever, but part of the message is to try to avoid being co-opted step by step. I mean, it's so easy to fall into these things, to give up one's values, to give up one's ideals, and okay, well, this is all right, this much, this much, this much. Before long, you're a commandant at Auschwitz. I mean, it's just, it's overwhelming, but I think it brings out a religious dimension. That is, it tells us something about the weakness of human nature, the temptations that can come our way, the power of the culture to drag us in directions that we don't want to go in, and hopefully also, when art works well, something of the redemptive moment in the midst of all of that.
Well, I think another example, you've mentioned catharsis and the whole expressionist school. Going back to painting, Vincent van Gogh is one of the most powerful examples that I can think of. I was in New York in early November of last year and saw a movie just when it came out called Vincent and Theo, about the two Van Gogh brothers. And the movie by Robert Altman, which I think is a wonderful one, I hope comes to Toledo, portrayed very graphically the suffering of the man. But if you look at the paintings, you will also see that. And you can enter into some sense into the inner struggle that he had, finally winding up in an insane asylum, cutting off his earlobe, and finally shooting himself and dying. There's a book that came out last year on Van Gogh with the title Van Gogh and God, a creative spiritual quest. And in the preface, Henry Van Nouwen says that he grew up in Holland and knew Van Gogh's paintings from an early age. And in the preface, he says this about Van Gogh. He says, "This deeply wounded and immensely gifted Dutchman brought me in touch with my own brokenness and talents." And he goes on to say that Vincent has always been one of the main spiritual guides in my life. And I think that's what happens when you go deeply into an artist or playwright, whatever it is, and experience what it is that they're giving, live through it in a way. And there's a catharsis, there's growth in you. You know, the artist can help all of us to see and to feel and really to grow in so many ways.
Right, and as you say, in so many ways. And if we sort of sort those out, I mean, there's some art that seems to make us feel one with the all. There's a mystical sense to it. I mean, Chinese landscape painting might be part of that notion, or the Impressionist paintings, that they give us a sense of the mystical. They bring us into a sense of harmony. We would usually associate the word beauty with those things. Impressionism is a very popular art form. But there's also another kind of religious reaction that can occur, and that is discontinuity, distance. That is the prophetic mode of religion. It's the prophets who say, "Thus says the Lord, we're not living up to the covenant. Thus says the Lord, the day of judgment is coming. If we're going to treat the poor like this, we are going to be punished." I mean, you get a whole prophetic side that the world's messed up. It's a distance from God. We're estranged from one another and from the very source of our being. Now, it's that other kind of thing that the world of art can open up for us. I often associate that, as I said before, with expressionism art. And we've mentioned a number of examples here. It seems like Guernica by Picasso, and we had the movies, the Platoon and 4th of July, and some television plays that bring out the problems of life and so on.
That kind of art can be both prophetic, dealing with social justice issues, for example, war, as in Guernica, or it can also be the inner turmoil of the artist, as in the case of Van Gogh, and talking about mental problems and tensions and trying to come to terms with the upheaval in his life. And we all have that to some extent. I mean, I think Van Gogh was a pretty extreme example of it, finally killing himself. But as Van Nouwen says in that quote...
Henry Nouwen, I think, is the one you were talking about.
Henry Van Nouwen, right, excuse me. He says, to come in contact with that has helped make him a better person.
Yes.
And I think art can do that.
So it brings sort of a healing quality to us by helping us to see. But what we're seeing in this case is a harsh reality. It's like, as we Christians say, it's the cross that's brought into the center of it all, even though the cross isn't painted there. What was it? There's a quote from Van Gogh that you like, that he's tried to paint the halo into his own paintings. Well, maybe what the Expressionists try to do is to paint the cross somehow into their paintings. But I like the point you made, Roland, I don't want to miss it. That is that you can paint the fact that there's poor in the world, that there's social sin, but you can also paint inner contradictions. And I take it the Expressionists very often were giving a vent to that they understood the way their own psyche was not whole, that they understood ways in which they were living in contradiction, and they found a way to put that onto the canvas.
Well, I think of a very famous painting by Edvard Munch called The Scream, and it's just this figure with the mouth open, no sound coming out. It's like this silent, terrible scream. That was, I guess parodied isn't the right word, but it was used in the recent movie Godfather Part 3. The very final scene is Al Pacino when his daughter is killed, and it was supposed to be him, but his daughter dies. And they imitate that I thought very effectively, that Edvard Munch painting. It says something about the anguish that a lot of people feel and the turmoil and the angst that they talked about, feeling that life is dark and terrible. And the image captures a lot of emotion that that has been experienced by a lot of people in a single picture.
And that image idea is so important, isn't it? I mean, images function that way. We carry images and symbols with us. It's often a way to summarize whole volumes of words. It's often a way to bring to focus a whole variety of feelings that you can't even integrate yourself, but somehow in the image or in the artistic experience they are able to be brought together. Maybe that's something, again, of what the world of art should do in dealing with contradictions, is this fundamental sense of integration.
Yeah, and reconciliation, bringing together and unity.
That strikes me as very important.
That's what you call mental health. I mean, it's that ability to see the unity of life, not to be continually pulled in all directions, and symbolic, means that in Greek. It's a bringing together, and diabolic is the opposite of it, going in all directions. I guess you could put it in those terms, to avoid the diabolic element and get cohesion, unity, to get back to the theological thing, God in some sense.
Indeed. So, Roland, we've been talking here about the world of religion and art, claiming that there's ways in which there is an implicit dimension in art, and that some art which we categorize maybe not always so beautiful, maybe even at times verges on the ugly, or it really puts us off in some ways, has a terribly important function. And that part of that function is to reveal to us the contradictions in human existence and the distance that exists between God and the human family. And so what we're always hoping is that art, as you have well said then, would function symbolically. That is, it would bring us together. It would be an integrating kind of force for us. And then I think we would really say that we found a harmonious way for religion and art to interact.